Hi everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us here at AlterCOP, and special thanks to the organizers for having us. I'm Kevin. I'm a principal with Blunomy, and I'll be moderating the panel today. Just a bit about myself before I pass the time to the panelists. You've heard from Pierre just now, so I won't talk about the company. I myself, I lead our practice in renewable fuel, so that covers green hydrogen as well as some of our bioenergy work for APAC. I'm particularly concerned about the developments in green hydrogen space, working with our clients to understand really what it takes to move forward, especially in terms of reducing emissions using this new solution. So I'm excited for the conversation today and this opportunity to really learn from the experts here. So joining me today is our esteemed panel. We have Iain Lawson, advisor on commodity markets with Ernst & Young. There's Tessa, who's the executive director of Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association of Singapore, and Tulika, who's co-founder and CEO from SunGreen H2. I'm going to give you the microphone to speak maybe about 30-40 seconds to quickly introduce yourself and explain why you're excited to do this work that you do.
Thanks, Kevin. My name is Iain. I'm a senior advisor to Ernst & Young here in Singapore. I'm actually a 35-year commodity trader by background. So I began my career with Shell, BP, Goldman Sachs, most recently Mercuria, either doing prop trading in oil, gas, and petchems, or increasingly getting involved in some of the new commodities like carbon, biofuels, and most recently hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, and the rest. I'm very excited by hydrogen because I think it's useful to set the context. If you think about decarbonisation globally is about decarbonising the point of generation of electricity and then electrifying the downstream. Except there's geographies and sectors where you can't. We're in one of the geographies where it doesn't work. Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, very much hard to decarbonise. And the sectors, aviation, shipping, steel, petchems, heavy transport. All of these, to me, are the use case for hydrogen or hydrogen derivatives. If you're doing it outside of that, then maybe you've got misaligned incentives. Maybe you're just doing it to show you can do it. And that does happen. Deutsche Bahn was trying to run its trains on hydrogen in the outskirts of Germany. And if you dug into it, you found out the hydrogen they were using was derived from brown coal. That's just Thomas the Tank Engine with extra steps. So knowing exactly the use cases that these should be placed is very important.
Tessa?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tessa from the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association of Singapore. So we are a young association established in end 2019, so it's about 5 years old now. So as a trade association, definitely we represent a group of companies as our members. And then the objectives of the associations are to actually discuss two major topics. So as the name suggests, it's not about hydrogen fuel cell or fuel cell. It's about hydrogen being as a fuel. And then, now it's actually expanded into various topics, different type of energy carriers, ammonia, methanol, there are liquid organic carriers, there are also solid state carriers nowadays. So then the other part definitely is about fuel cells technology. So fuel cell technologies actually existed maybe more than 20 years already, right? Begin with like Japan and then also Korea. So major automobile makers have been looking into this technology for years. So it was for different reasons, I believe, right? Comparing to now, we're actually talking about why hydrogen is important for decarbonization. That time, it was just a different alternative technology for automobile. So I think we have come a long way about how we define hydrogen as a role of decarbonization. So maybe later we'll deep dive into it.
Yep,
thank you.
Definitely. Tulika, you want to introduce yourself as well?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Tulika Raj. I am CEO and co-founder of SunGreen H2. A little bit about SunGreen H2 first. SunGreen H2 is a leading technology innovator in the space of electrolyzers. We like to say that we supercharge electrolyzers, the machines used to make green hydrogen by splitting water molecules into H2 and O2 using renewable energy. And we say that because we can produce twice as much hydrogen from the electrolyzers, lowering energy consumption by 20%. We do all this magic without using any precious metals and have very long, durable, stable devices that we are deploying as far afield as Europe and as close by as Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. So we really believe, and we have a vision for hydrogen, green hydrogen, to be affordable. Without affordability, it is very difficult to scale up what is essentially an underlying commodity. You know that when traders like Iain are getting involved in the business, it is a commodity. It needs to go down to commodity pricing. That's the only way for global green hydrogen markets to be created. So we're in the business of making sure that green hydrogen is low cost. And my personal background is I've been in the energy industry for over 20 years, initially in Schlumberger, then BP, building wind and solar farms, believe it or not, and then now in green hydrogen molecules. I look forward to the discussion. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Very impressive. Before we get into the discussion and I start throwing my questions, I just want to remind the audience that you can actually scan the QR code and enter your questions into the platform. And I'll pick out the questions to ask the panelists. But before handling your question, given that I'm the moderator, I'm just going to ask my questions first. And we'll start with Tessa. What would you maybe quickly explain to the audience what is green hydrogen and why it's such an important piece of the puzzle for the climate transition?
Yeah, so I think before I address this question, I actually don't want to make it sound silly. I look at the crowd. I guess maybe most of the audience are actually familiar with this topic somehow. Or if not, the panelists just now also explained, like Tulika has already explained, right? What is green hydrogen about? It's actually produced through renewable electricity. So that is a general understanding of green hydrogen. And if you have been following green hydrogen topics, then you will now realize that there's a lot of colors nowadays. And some of the countries are actually stopping using colors as reference points. They're actually referring to like the carbon emissions of each production methodology. So I think this is still evolving, yeah, but we just generally addressing it as green hydrogen for now. And why is it important? And also Iain has already explained, right? So it can actually be used in decarbonization of hard to debate sectors. So heavy industries, maritime sectors. Yeah, so these are also some of the use cases that people are now talking as mainstream. But the other part actually, later maybe I'll refer to Tulika to further elaborate, is that green hydrogen actually can unlock certain accessibility issues for power. Yeah, so this is something that may be similar to battery storage in a sense, but it comes in the different forms, right? So through off-grid deployment for small-scale electrolyzers, then coupled with either fuel cell or small turbines, actually it can provide electricity to some of the rural areas or isolated island areas. So these are some of the great advantages besides just the business point of views. It's also to benefit the community.
Yeah, so I guess you heard from Tessa. I think the role that green hydrogen has to play is beyond just the energy transition, but also providing energy access to some of the users who previously do not yet have access to energy or electricity. The next question I guess would be just to give the audience a bit of a snapshot of the world today in terms of adopting green hydrogen or adopting hydrogen in their energy system. Maybe Tulika can answer this question.
Yeah, thanks. Apologies if I'm repeating known information, but it's not a new market. There's 100 million tons plus of hydrogen that's currently being used worldwide already. And predominantly, we are using hydrogen currently to make ammonia. And why is this important is because this is how you feed the world. Ammonia being an essential component to make ingredient or feedstock to make fertilizers. This is how we feed an urbanizing population. Now let's think about dynamics. Other than ammonia, there's also methanol and petrochemical refining that uses hydrogen literally as a feedstock for a high energy content. As the world goes to 2050 and as we urbanize further, as our population growth goes to the 8 billion problem, We have more agricultural-related needs, therefore a larger demand for ammonia. It's not going away anytime soon. Methanol is a commodity that is used to make everything that we use on a daily basis, including car parts and paints. So that's not going away as you urbanize further and the population grows. And there will be some drop-off as we hit peak oil for petrochemical refining to a certain extent. So the IEA and McKinsey and the Hydrogen Council and a few other folks predicted a 500 million ton market for hydrogen. So a 5x growth from 2020 levels out to 2050. That's a large number. Do we believe it? Maybe we don't believe it. 2024, we have seen some coming off of these frothy numbers from 2020. We have seen numbers like 20% lower, maybe not a 500 million ton, maybe a 400, maybe a 200 million ton market. Guess what? It doesn't matter. No matter what the underlying fundamental growth driver for hydrogen market growth, it is poised for growth for sure. And right now, low carbon or clean hydrogen is less than 1% of the overall market. And given we are all living in a carbon constrained world, there is no other thing to happen here other than for low carbon hydrogen to increase its share in this mix of hydrogen production going out. If we talk about near-term numbers, I can tell you that there has been since 2020 a literal doubling of the number of investments that are coming into the clean hydrogen electrolyzer space. Projects have quadrupled. The investment cost, unfortunately, has more than quadrupled. As well as the overall capacity growth for electrolyzers is at 200x. Where is all this growth going to come from? Technologies like sun green H2s are obviously poised to capture this growth and this demand in the market. But all of these technologies are driving towards one fundamental thing, which is to find an alternative way to produce hydrogen without any carbon emissions that is cheap enough for the world to continue using it at the $1.5 per kg that is currently consuming it. A lot of the ammonia manufacturers, steel producers, petchem refiners are very price sensitive customers. There isn't a huge amount of elasticity in this market. So what needs to happen is that we urgently need to find ways to make hydrogen cheap. And I think a lot of the work that we are doing in the green hydrogen space is intended to allow just that. I'll pause here, but that's a bit of a state of the affair.
Thanks, Tulika. Yeah, I think the point about the point that the panelists made so far is really that hydrogen itself is nothing new, but what we are trying to push towards in a decarbonized world is ways and approaches of producing hydrogen and getting them to the end markets that would be low carbon. And I guess the question right now, and maybe I'll direct it to Iain, is how do you see us moving towards that trajectory of that future? What are some of the key elements that needs to be in place or have been in place and still and we're making our way there?
The fundamental thing at the moment, I think, is carrots and sticks. If you look at where things are happening globally, it's some of the countries we mentioned already. So Japan has a new contract for difference mechanism that they're introducing to try and make long-term hydrogen projects bankable by filling in the gap between the cost of production and the alternatives that consumers are willing to pay. Korea has a tender process for power generated using low carbon or green ammonia. Singapore has an open tender at the moment between the Energy Markets Authority and the MPA for green or low carbon ammonia for shipping bunkers and for power generation. The big ones, of course, are Fit for 55 in Europe and the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. So this is where a lot of the focus and the resources have been going, the places where basically people are being paid to do this. The subsidies can be spectacular. In the US, under the Inflation Reduction Act, if you've got the right hydrogen, which is domestically produced, with unions and apprentices and everything else, you can get $3,000 per ton of subsidies. But the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, it's a cliff. It's huge subsidies for something which is pretty much 100% green and nothing if it's a little bit worse. If you look at Asia, Asia is coming in a much more pragmatic manner. The Koreans and the Japanese would much rather pay half the price of green hydrogen for something which is maybe 60 or 70% green. If they're going to wind up mixing it with coal in any case, then why pay a premium for 100% green? So it's very much a function of where's the carrot, where's the stick, and there's a lot of money going into trying to smooth over some of the logistic issues as well. As Tulika said, I mean, ammonia and hydrogen, they're big markets. Ammonia, I think, is a 200 million ton a year physical market. Only about a tenth of that actually moves around the world. That's going to have to change as ammonia becomes an energy commodity rather than just an agricultural commodity. And people are nervous about that. People know how to move ammonia as a cargo, but they get very jittery when you start thinking about it as a fuel. I don't know how many of you have been on like a ship, but almost the first thing you smell when you go on a ship is fuel. So if you're in a situation where if you can smell the fuel, you're dead, that's got a problem.
Thanks, Iain. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on its head when you talk about the carrots and stick and prevailing regulatory environments and the frameworks that the governments are using to encourage the use and production. We have a question from the audience here about the prevailing regulations that apply to transport and use of hydrogen. Are there any that you've observed and in the world right now, and how's that going to really impact the uptake in the upcoming trajectory?
We don't even have a prevailing technology, let alone prevailing regulations, to be honest. I mean, there's many different ways that you can potentially move this. Moving liquid hydrogen is proving particularly complicated. There's MCH and liquid organic hydrogen carriers, which are promising but expensive. Ammonia is generally viewed as the way to go, but it's toxic and it's corrosive. So inevitably there's going to be regulations and protocols for handling that need to go in place. Methanol is the best of them because it's straightforward, it's relatively non-toxic, it disperses if it leaks, and it doesn't require expensive liquefaction at low temperatures. So at the moment, it's lightly regulated because the technology hasn't really settled down.
Yeah. Maybe Tessa?
Maybe just to add on additionally, so just now I also mentioned that there is also a rising technology, the metal state, solid state hydrogen. So one of the carriers called metal hydride. So actually one of our members actually working on that technology. But definitely there are arguments about the energy intensity the solid state hydrogen can carry versus the liquid forms. I think there are endless debates about what is the best way of transporting hydrogen if you want to use it as a fuel eventually, right? So conversion loss, right? The transportation efficiency loss, right? And then to convert it back to hydrogen gas. So as Iain mentioned, there is actually no concrete ways of saying it. It all depends on what is the final use of it. So I think now the industry is really coming down to the details about how the demand and the supply meet each other's need, right? So you kind of cater to what you actually need and to try to move the demand and supply center to as close to one another as possible, because currently trans-ocean shipment is just not viable yet. Yeah, even though we talk about like we actually been shipping ammonia many years, right? But the scale that we are about to see is also different, right? And then to use ammonia directly as a fuels is also unseen before. So there are definitely challenges in different type of carriers. Yeah.
One gets the sense that there's a bit of shipbuilding going on worldwide, even as we try to sail the ship. So gives you a good idea of the state of affairs.
And I think at this moment, I just want to say that there are roving microphones. So if any member of the audience wants to sort of put up a question by speaking, please just put up your hand and I'll send a mic to you. But meanwhile, we've been talking about infrastructure, essentially, the infrastructure to move hydrogen from the supply point to its user. Maybe we can dwell a little bit on the user side. So on the demand side, is there big changes that needs to take place from the user's equipment's point of view or new investments in order for them to use hydrogen? Tulika?
Okay, I mean, for us, we really see the existing hydrogen market as the largest user and consumer of any decarbonized or clean version of the fuel. And so there is no change as such in using it. If anything, I'll talk about water electrolysis. It's cleaner to produce it than steam methane reforming using fossil fuels because you're essentially splitting water. So there are no contaminants. We need to dry the hydrogen so it's a bit easier to use and you get those 5 nines of purity. But then you think about the newer use cases. So let's assume that the 100 million ton market that is gray hydrogen or fossil fuel based hydrogen now, it can be supplied with a cleaner version of the fuel, and that's already a 100 million ton market to replace because there's virtually no green hydrogen in the market or clean hydrogen in the market right now. We are creating almost 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions from the current production of gray hydrogen. Then you talk about newer use cases, and something that Tessa alluded to earlier, different derivatives of hydrogen and hydrogen itself is finding use in a number of different applications. Depending on how hard it is to decarbonize a particular country's requirements or sector, you can use hydrogen as a potential vector. You can use ammonia and you can use other derivatives. Let me explain what do I mean by that. It means that we have not traditionally talked about hydrogen use in power generation, yet we do now. We have not traditionally talked about hydrogen, ammonia, and methanol for greener shipping and aviation. We do now. Why? Because there are vectors that you can produce using green hydrogen if it's cheap enough that can go into decarbonized fuels and go and replace some of your carbon intensive supply chain in these hard to abate, hard to decarbonize sectors. What is stopping this from happening right now is resource allocation. Again, just like oil and gas is not found everywhere in the world, wind and solar and renewable energy is not found everywhere in the world. And so we do have these hotspots where you need to look for cheap green electrons. That's really why this market for green molecules is today under discussion, is because globally, over 90% of the world's electricity markets, wind and solar are the cheapest new form of generation, is because you have cheap green electrons that you can think about deriving cheap green molecules. So an effort that we've been trying as mankind, I guess, to look at since the 1960s and 90s to produce cheap green molecules is now really only made possible because you've got green electrons. Again, if you don't have access to those green electrons, then perhaps green hydrogen production as a hub is not for us here in Singapore, but perhaps we are the hub that is trading it and trading other derivatives like ammonia and methanol. So this is one answer. In Europe, however, it's an energy security and supply question. So there is, speaking about going back to carrots and sticks, in the European Union, there is a legislation that asks for 42.5% of all industrial users of hydrogen to now source it from non-biological means, which means no fossil fuels. This means that a 10 million ton market, that is the European hydrogen market, overnight has a demand for 4.2 million tons of green hydrogen. Guess what? In the European Union, they have legislated a requirement for 10 million tons of domestic production and 10 million tons additionally of import by 2030. So these are all sort of market-making mechanisms that are creating a demand. We hear about the Biden administration now passed, having the IRA in the US, but again, supply side incentives are not enough. If you have the demand side incentives, this comes faster in terms of adoption. You can look at any market in Asia Pacific, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Japan, Korea. You will find the same kind of drivers that are arguing for what kind of decarbonization vector, which molecule is being used for, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's ammonia, whether it's methanol. It really depends on the individual regulatory environment.
Thanks, Tulika. I think we have a question from the audience.
Hello. Yes. Just to go back a bit on Singapore and the Singapore hydrogen strategy. Can you elaborate a bit about that, and also tell us about some concrete things that have been done here in Singapore, potentially to illustrate a little bit. So I had a friend, Taras, who did the H3 dynamics. It was like drones powered by hydrogens and also trucks powered by hydrogen, but from Singapore. But are there other concrete use cases?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. So essentially about the hydrogen strategy in Singapore as well as use cases in Singapore. Maybe I'll let Tessa respond to that first.
Yeah. So yeah, I've been briefing about national hydrogen strategy since the launch. So it's been about 2 years. Actually, we've been waiting for more updates, right? Because for people that has read this strategy before, you might find it brief, right? To be honest here, right? You don't see a lot of numbers, which is weird, right? Because Singapore loves numbers. But we don't see a lot of numbers, except that they kind of like put it up front that maybe up to 50% of power generation will be coming from hydrogen or its derivatives by 2050. So that's the only number that you can find from the paper. And I have to be very honest as well, that there hasn't been a lot of changes on the policy as of now in Singapore, but you definitely see other announcements that's been coming out, right? So Iain just now has mentioned about the ammonia bunkering and power generation projects. And also up to now, we have total 9 power generation plants announcement that there will be hydrogen ready starting from 2026, 2027 onwards, that you will see that the turbines will be built and then you'll be ready to burn some portion of hydrogen. Now the question is actually on upstream, I call it upstream, the source of hydrogen, right? That's actually kind of like slowing the process because Singapore as a net importer for any kind of carriers, we have to look for sources from outside Singapore, and where will it then be cost competitive? So this is really a question, but we have also seen other private entities from Singapore that is actually taking some moves, signing some agreements with some of the project developers on sourcing green hydrogens in overseas. So yeah, short answer is that you may not see a lot of movement on the paper yet, but you do see movements in actions. Yeah.
Maybe just to add to that, so the room doesn't think of hydrogen in the wrong way. Hydrogen is not going to wind up being a global fuel in quite the same way as, say, liquefied natural gas or crude oil is a global fuel. The use cases for hydrogen are going to be much more localized. You might be using it in a different way in almost every location because of the geographical situation. Again, Japan struggles to decarbonize its power generation. It's had some bad experiences with nuclear. Hydrogen will be part of that. Singapore and Japan, it might turn out that one of the best vectors to get hydrogen into the country is an existing hydrocarbon, like say LNG. Singapore is looking at the idea of bringing in natural gas, which it already does, splitting it through autothermal reforming into hydrogen and CO2, and then sequestering the carbon dioxide. It's doing that already on a small scale for the town gas network. Town gas network is currently, I think, 55% hydrogen. It's one of the highest percentages in the world. So all these solutions are going to be localized to a certain degree. It's never going to be a global traded product in the same way as crude oil or LNG.
Yeah, I think what we should realize is that the energy system has never been that globalized until very recently, and there's been a lot of technologies over the years that's developed to a state where we are able to have a very sort of common type of energy system and fuels. In particular, Japan, for example, because of quakes and the infrastructure just doesn't allow for gaseous fuels to be moving around in a cost-effective manner. So different energy systems will require different solutions, and green hydrogen does become a contender for some of them.
One nice thing you can do as well with Tulika's technology is you can split the point of generation of electrons and consumption of electrons. One of the reasons that Japan has nuclear power stations onshore is because it needs to be close to the point of consumption to get into the grid. If you can dislocate nuclear power to an island in the middle of the Pacific, generate green molecules from green electrons, green molecules are fungible. You can put them on a boat and take them anywhere. So it's a way of distancing from the point of generation that may solve some of the problems for a country like Japan.
Thanks, Iain. We have a question here, so let me address the question that's put up first. It's regarding the challenge of scaling green hydrogen such that it's competitive against fossil fuel. I think Tessa alluded to that. I guess my question is more for Iain. Do you think, based on what you have said, do you think then that this day doesn't actually come, but that in specific applications it makes sense?
It will come in certain places where the land is cheap and sunny or windy enough that you can generate something which is on a localized scale competitive with power, with hydrocarbons. But it's likely to be because in those specific locations, the hydrocarbons were already quite expensive, either because it's got no resources of its own as a country, or the logistics are particularly complex. So you're never, I think, going to have green H2 on a cargo basis is cheaper than, I don't know, crude oil on a cargo basis. But if you're looking at things on a much more localized basis, there will absolutely be places where hydrogen becomes the economic solution.
Thanks. Yeah,
And
that's
just
a good
to, let me add to that, sorry, I was going to say that if you've got like a large network, like a large landmass, like North America, for example, moving hydrogen around by pipeline is something that we're very familiar with and have done it. So we're in a very unique situation in Singapore, but if we think about this on a global basis, moving hydrogen molecules by pipeline, storing hydrogen in a salt cavern storage is cheaper per unit of storage and per unit of transmission than moving around electrons or storing electrons. So it's worth keeping that in mind as we think about solutions for different markets. Now, not everywhere in the world you have salt cavern storage. Not everywhere in the world you have enough of a pipeline infrastructure. Places like Europe, there's a lot of commitment to develop this pipeline infrastructure intercontinentally, but you can't do that transatlantically. So different solutions for different markets, but yes, absolutely. There are challenges to actually thinking about producing lots and lots of green hydrogen down in Australia, and then thinking about a vector and moving it across, halfway across the world. That may not make sense anytime soon. But yet, as Iain has also alluded, there are ways to find the right solution for the right market, given your geological, geopolitical conditions, your regulatory support and requirements, and find either green hydrogen on one of the vectors like ammonia, which is cleaner, clean ammonia and clean methanol to try and meet your needs instead. So different, horses for courses.
Thanks, Tulika. And maybe just to offer my perspective on this as well, we typically think that fossil fuel prices are going to stay the same or within the same bands. We don't, if you look at it historically, there's been huge fluctuations in fossil fuel prices as well because of supply issues. And the world can stomach such huge volatility in energy cost. So as we move forward, we should recognize the role as well of carbon pricing that will basically increase fossil fuel price and not take for granted that it's going to stay at that same level. And the market, we all acknowledge, needs to reflect that environmental cost, and that could help as well.
Yeah, maybe just to throw some numbers into it. Let's take an example of shipping, and let's use Europe because Europe has a developed carbon market. When you get to IMO 2030, people are going to have to find some way of decarbonizing by about, let's say, 45% per vessel. You could switch from fuel to LNG, which gets you maybe about 20%. So there's another 25% or so that, one way or another, you have to cut the carbon output of your shipping. Let's say you move to ammonia. Ammonia has half the energy density of fuel oil. So if ammonia is, let's say optimistically, $1,000 a ton, and your fuel oil is $600 a ton, you're now paying $2,000 for the same energy content as your $600 worth of fuel oil. You are going to get some money back by having got rid of the carbon output from the fuel. 1 ton of fuel oil will produce about 3 tons of carbon dioxide. So let's call that, for the sake of argument, $300. So you've now got $2,000 minus $300 equals $600 of fuel. So there's a big gap. You're looking at $1,700 versus $600. So there's a long, long way still for that price to fall. And either the cost of ammonia will have to come down dramatically, or the cost of carbon will have to go up dramatically, and the global applicability of carbon pricing has to widen. So just to put some numbers on it.
Yeah, just to illustrate the magnitudes as well. And I guess there's a question from the audience here that started with this observation that probably a lot of hydrogen projects are realizing that, which Iain just mentioned, and now being withdrawn. And I'll open this question to all the panelists. What do you think would be the key demand driver in the short term that will help green hydrogen take off?
I would like to maybe just offer up that Regulatory certainty is very important for any long duration infrastructure project that is relying on project financing to get off the ground and has equity backers who need to make their IRRs and so on and so forth. So regulatory certainty is very, very important. It's worth wading through the weeds and looking at how many projects are being done and where. And you'll find that it's where there's market uncertainty in terms of, let's say, perhaps recent election outcomes in certain parts of the world where a lot of the legislation that's existing is now expected to be rolled back. That might create uncertainty that doesn't allow projects to go forward. But I would like to draw attention to the nearly $80 billion worth of investments that are going forward that are based on electrolyzers. And guess what? The bulk of those are based out of Europe, yes. But large 1 gigawatt projects already taken FID in India for green ammonia with off-takers including Keppel in Singapore and others, as well as in LATAM. So the point is that as long as there is regulatory certainty, drivers that are being well supported for a 25-year offtake that makes sense commercially to the offtakers, projects are going ahead. I think what's coming off in terms of project cancellations is really the froth that usually accompanies early technology discoveries saying, oh, hydrogen is going to decarbonize everything. It's a silver bullet. It's a magic pill. That's not true. And anybody who's looking at the data, as Iain said, knows that this was never going to be true to begin with. But this does not take away from the fundamental business drivers that do allow hydrogen to provide a real decarbonization solution in very specific cases. There, the projects are still going ahead.
And just a word on what Tulika said about project pricing. If you think about how natural gas used to price, you used to have long-term contracts to be able to guarantee pretty much the economics of a project. And the premium, if you like, went to a producer that could guarantee security of supply into a Tokyo Electric or a Kogas or whoever else. Gradually, that changed to a market where the person that collected the economic rent on LNG was the person who could control a global optimization of a portfolio rather than just the producer. A lot of the players who are now looking at hydrogen and ammonia, they're LNG players. Typically, if I call around traders and say, who's looking at hydrogen in your shop, it's the LNG guys. So they're looking to the same value in flexibility model for hydrogen and ammonia as they have for LNG. And if you think about ammonia, it's great for that, because if you have green ammonia, you can sell it as grey ammonia, hopefully plus a little bit of a premium, or you can sell it as bunker fuel, or you can sell it as co-firing with coal, or you can sell it as an LNG substitute, or you can sell it as a bunch of different things. So that flexibility becomes tremendously valuable. We've been marketing ammonia on behalf of a few clients, and in many cases, the greatest interest is coming from portfolio players who are interested for the flexibility value that it brings, rather than because of a specific use case they have in mind.
Thanks for sharing that. And yeah, maybe just a question in response to what you just said. Does that help with the financing of the projects, or is that actually causing difficulties for financing the projects?
That doesn't help the projects directly, because typically a trader is going to try and avoid paying the full value of that flexibility premium. But what you are seeing is things like the contract for difference mechanism in Japan. That's specifically designed around offering stability over up to a 15-year period, so that the projects can be financed. If you know that your cost of production is here, but the best that somebody who, say, has an LNG alternative or a grey ammonia alternative will pay is here, the Japanese government will look at making up that difference, gradually declining over a 15-year period, in a way that allows you to go to your bank and say, my revenues are stable for the payback period.
Yeah. So I guess we can take away that firstly, the government needs to put in place that long-term regulation and structure. But I think working alongside the market is also a useful strategy for government. So maybe to respond to the question earlier about the Singapore hydrogen strategy, just to defend the government a little, I think the Singapore government is watching that space very closely and figuring out what are the policies that can work alongside the market. so as to make sure that we secure our own low carbon future. Now, Thibault has already flashed out the 5 minutes left card, so maybe I'll just have a final question to round up for each of the member of this panel. So for anyone sitting here who's really concerned about climate change and the challenges that we face today, what would you say to them? Why should they care about green hydrogen? Yes, Tulika.
I think we should, okay, let's talk about decarbonization and why we should care, because we're all trying to get to a net zero future for our future generations. So I think we're all aligned in that sense. I think there's not a lot of naysayers left for the green electrons thesis anymore. In other words, we all believe that lots and lots of wind and solar is in our futures, in our collective futures, and the next generation's futures. What happens when you put lots and lots of green electrons on a grid that is like 100 years old? It takes trillions of dollars of investment to scale up the infrastructure that we are living in and surrounded by today. In order for a lot of this additional renewable input also to come online, you've got to think about what kind of infrastructure changes are required in order for our grids to keep up with this. And not just here in Singapore, but worldwide. Think about the outback in Australia, all the way to the United States, to India. Think about European Union, think about lots of places. Where you have renewables, you have intermittency. And where you have intermittency, you cannot always absorb all the massive amounts of wind and solar and other renewables that are coming onto the system. If you believe that much at least, you should believe that there should be a way for us to not waste curtailed renewables. At a certain level, it starts to make sense to run up electrolyzers, soak up all this excess renewables when you can't dispatch it into the grid, and then eventually store it and put it back through a fuel cell. That's one way in which you will see the future at very large scales of renewable consumption in the 2030s, 40s, and 50s start to make sense for green hydrogen. Believe that. Also believe the fact that the existing hydrogen use case needs to be decarbonized, and that's already 100 million tons. So let's get 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere.
Tessa?
Okay, maybe I come in from a personal approach. I think climate issues is in everyone's heart, or most of the people's heart. I can't say everyone's, right? Because, right? So politics aside, right? So actually everyone is concerned about the environment. Sometimes I wonder, right? What does hydrogen mean to us as individual, right? What can we actually do as individual, right? This thing seems to be not really relevant to us in our daily lives. Yeah, but there are also different type of people may be thinking that hydrogen can be a direct replacement of fossil fuel. So just use hydrogen in everything that's now we are using for fossil fuel, and then problem will be solved. But it turns out not to be true, right? Because there's a lot of practical concerns, project development concerns, finance concerns that we are already seeing now. That's why leads to a lot of the projects that actually cannot reach FID, right? So I think eventually it is really just now what we have discussed to really look at what will then be the actual use cases that is right for hydrogen, complementary to other solutions, low carbon solutions that we are now seeing. So I guess maybe
Thanks, Tessa.
message, yeah.
And yes?
Yeah, I'd maybe echo Tulika's point that the demand for green electrons is clear. It's why we're here today. The potential to produce green electrons is everywhere, anywhere that's windy and sunny. The problem is that demand and that supply are not in the same places. It's not practical to connect these things with cables, not over more than fairly limited distances. So hydrogen presents a way to turn a green electron into a green molecule that can be shipped anywhere around the world like a traditional hydrocarbon. It's connective tissue for the decarbonization of the planet.
Thank you. So I think we've come to the end of our panel. Join me in thanking the panel, and just special mention that we have 2 ladies on this panel following a panel with 5 guys. So it's really great to be able to see more gender diversity in this space.